Right now, beneath your feet, a war is ending. Not with violence, not with victory, but with something stranger. A treaty written in chemicals, negotiated through roots, enforced by organisms that predate both sides by 1 billion years. We thought plants competed. We were right. But we missed what happened next. In the densest forests, the most crowded meadows, the richest soil on Earth, thousands of species grow side by side. Same sunlight, same water, same nutrients. They should be strangling each other, starving each other, fighting for every photon that touches a leaf, but they're not. They're sharing. Not out of kindness. Plants don't have kindness. Out of something more fundamental. Something that changed the rules of survival itself. What if competition isn't the end of the story? What if it's just the beginning? Tonight we're going beneath the surface of the oldest conflict on land. We'll follow the evolution of strategies that let enemies become neighbours, neighbours become networks, and networks become something that looks almost like consideration. By the end, you might see every garden, every forest, every patch of weeds differently. Not as individuals fighting to survive, but as communities that learned the most unexpected lesson in biology. Sometimes, the best way to win is to stop fighting. So let's begin where all sharing begins, with the problem of too many bodies in too little space. This is Omni, stories about life, matter, and the mystery in between. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you believe curiosity should never end. Picture a single square metre of tropical rainforest floor. You can't see it, but right now in that small patch of soil, there are roots from over 200 different plant species. 200. All reaching into the same earth, all pulling water from the same reservoir, all competing for the same minerals. Ferns and orchids and saplings and vines, tiny herbs and massive trees, each one anchored to its spot, unable to move, unable to escape. This should be chaos. This should be carnage. And for millions of years, it was. Early plants, the first green things to colonize land about 470 million years ago, had it relatively easy. There was space, endless space, a barren planet of rock and water waiting to be claimed. The first moss that crept onto shore didn't have to compete with anything except geology. It just had to survive the air. But success breeds crowding. Those first pioneers spread. They reproduced. They diversified. And eventually, inevitably, they started running into each other. Same hillside, same stream bed, same patch of sunlight. And when plants meet, when they occupy the same space, they compete. They have to, because unlike animals, plants can't hunt, they can't forage, they can't migrate when resources run low. They're rooted. Everything they need, light, water, nutrients, has to come to them, or they have to grow toward it. So they grew, faster, taller, deeper. They evolved leaves to capture more sunlight. They evolved roots to mine deeper soil. They evolved chemicals to poison their neighbours' growth. They evolved thorns and spines and toxic sap to defend the territory they claimed. This is classical Darwinian competition, survival of the fittest. And it works. It drives evolution, sharpens adaptations, creates the stunning diversity of plant life we see today. But here's what Darwin couldn't have known. What we're only discovering now, competition has a limit. Push it too far, make it too efficient, too ruthless, and everyone loses. Plants that poison their neighbours too effectively poison the soil they both depend on. Trees that grow so tall they monopolise sunlight invest so much energy and structure. They become vulnerable to wind, disease, collapse. Roots that extract every last mineral from the soil leave nothing for the microbes that break down organic matter and replenish those same minerals. There's an edge, a threshold, where winning the competition means destroying the system that makes life possible in the first place. And evolution, over hundreds of millions of years, found that edge. Then it found something else. According to research published in 2024 by ecologist Suzanne Simard at the University of British Columbia, the forests we walk through aren't just collections of individual trees competing for resources. They're networks, trees of different species, connected underground through fungal threads, actively sharing carbon, nutrients, and chemical signals. Sharing. Not competing. Not just tolerating each other, but cooperating. This changes everything we thought we knew about plant survival. Because if plants can share, if they've evolved mechanisms to cooperate across species boundaries, then the story of evolution isn't just about competition. It's about something more complex, more sophisticated. It's about learning to live together in spaces too crowded for anyone to survive alone. But cooperation doesn't just appear. It's not a gift. It's a strategy. And like all strategies, it evolved because it solved a problem. A very specific problem that emerges whenever too many living things try to occupy the same place at the same time. Ecologists call it the packing problem. How do you fit the maximum number of species into a minimum amount of space without them all destroying each other? The answer, it turns out, isn't about being stronger. It's about being different. Different enough that you're not competing for exactly the same resources at exactly the same time in exactly the same way. This is niche partitioning, and it's everywhere once you start looking. In a single tree, different species of epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants, occupy different zones. Orchids near the top where light is brightest, ferns in the middle where moisture collects, mosses near the base where shade is deepest. They're all using the same tree, but they're not competing because they've divided it into distinct territories based on their different needs. The same thing happens underground. Some plants send roots deep, tapping water from 10, 20, 50 feet below the surface. Others spread shallow roots wide, catching rain before it percolates down. Some specialize in absorbing nitrogen. Others focus on phosphorus. They're all mining the same soil, but they're mining different resources from different depths at different times. And it happens in time. Some plants grow in spring, flower in the early summer, set seed by July, and go dormant before autumn. Others don't even germinate until late summer, growing through fall and winter when competition for light is lower. They're using the same meadow, but they're using it in shifts. Niche partitioning is how you pack a rainforest, how you fit 200 species into 1 square meter. Each species finds its own angle, its own strategy, its own slice of the resource pie that doesn't perfectly overlap with anyone else's. But even that isn't enough, because niches can only be divided so finely. Eventually you run out of ways to be different. You run out of resources to partition, and then plants have to do something harder. They have to actively help each other. This sounds absurd. Why would a plant help a competitor? What's the evolutionary advantage of giving your rival the resources it needs to outgrow you? The answer lies in understanding what plants actually need help with, and what they're willing to trade for it. Let's follow the nitrogen, because nitrogen is the key to everything that's about to unfold. It's the element that builds proteins, DNA, chlorophyll, the machinery of life itself, and it's everywhere. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. The air you're breathing right now is mostly nitrogen, but plants can't use it, not directly. Atmospheric nitrogen is N2, 2 nitrogen atoms triple bonded together, one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. Breaking that bond requires enormous energy. Plants don't have that energy. So despite being surrounded by nitrogen, most plants are nitrogen starved. It's the limiting factor in growth, the bottleneck, the resource most likely to run out first, unless they partner with bacteria that can break that bond. Bacteria that can pull nitrogen from the air and convert it into ammonia, a form plants can absorb and use. These bacteria exist. They're called rhizobia, and they live in nodules on the roots of legumes, beans, peas, clover, acacia trees. The plant builds special structures, little cellular factories, and invites the bacteria to live inside. The bacteria fix nitrogen. The plant provides sugar from photosynthesis. It's a trade. Carbon for nitrogen, energy for fertility. But here's what makes this relevant to sharing space. The nitrogen doesn't stay in the legume, it leaks. When legume roots die and decompose, when nodules shed, when the plant itself dies, all that fixed nitrogen enters the soil, and other plants that can't fix nitrogen themselves, absorb it. According to a 2024 study by soil ecologist Janet Sprent, legumes can increase soil nitrogen levels by 50 to 200% in areas where they grow. They're subsidizing their neighbors, fertilizing their competitors. Why would evolution allow this? Why isn't there a legume that hoards all its nitrogen? Because in crowded ecosystems, generosity is stability. If you're the only plant thriving while everything around you withers, you're vulnerable. Your soil erodes, your pollinators disappear. The fungal networks you depend on collapse because there aren't enough diverse root systems to support them. But if you share nitrogen, the community around you stays healthy. The soil stays rich. The microbial diversity stays high. And you, the legume, benefit from living in a more stable, more resilient system. The cost of sharing is less than the cost of collapse. This is the foundation of coexistence, not just tolerance, not just dividing resources, but active investment in the community's health, because your survival depends on the system, not just your individual success. And once that door opens, once plants start trading resources across species boundaries, the strategies get more sophisticated, more surprising, more like what we'd call, if we saw it in animals, social behaviour. Tonight we're going to trace how plants learn to share, from chemical warfare to chemical communication, from strangling competitors to supporting allies, from isolated individuals to networks that think and respond and adapt as collective units. We'll discover how trees recognise their relatives and give them preferential treatment, how plants warn each other about insect attacks through airborne signals, how some species act as nurses, sheltering vulnerable seedlings beneath their canopy until they're strong enough to compete. And we'll ask the question that makes all of this strange. If plants can cooperate, if they've evolved elaborate systems for sharing resources and information, what does that say about intelligence, about awareness, about the line we draw between living and thinking? Because the forests are doing something that requires information processing, decision-making, adaptive response. They're managing complexity. They're solving the hardest problem in ecology, how to pack infinite diversity into finite space. And they've been doing it for longer than animals have existed. Let's find out how. Maybe cooperation started with knowing who to cooperate with. Let's begin underground, in the root systems of Douglas fir trees in the coastal forests of British Columbia, because something unusual is happening there. Something that shouldn't be possible if plants are just passive mechanical organisms responding blindly to chemical gradients. The trees are making choices. In 2024, researcher Suzanne Simard and her team at the University of British Columbia published findings that fundamentally changed how we understand plant behaviour. They tracked carbon movement through forest networks using radioactive isotopes, carbon-14, that could be followed as it moved from tree to tree through fungal connections. What they found was this. Adult Douglas firs were sending carbon to younger trees nearby, feeding them, supporting their growth when they were shaded, when their own photosynthesis wasn't enough to sustain them. This alone was remarkable. Trees actively transferring resources to other trees. But then they noticed something stranger. The adult trees weren't sending carbon equally to all nearby seedlings. They were preferential. They gave more to their own offspring, seedlings that had grown from their seeds, than to unrelated seedlings of the same species growing the same distance away. The trees were recognizing kin, distinguishing relatives from strangers, and choosing to invest more heavily in their own genetic lineage. How? Plants don't have brains. They don't have nervous systems. They don't have anything we'd recognize as sensory organs, but they have chemistry. And chemistry, it turns out, is enough. When roots grow close together, they exude compounds, organic acids, sugars, proteins, into the soil around them. These compounds are specific. They vary by species, by individual, by genetic relatedness. They're chemical signatures, fingerprints written in molecules. Other roots encounter these signatures. They have receptor proteins in their cell membranes, the same kind of molecular recognition systems that immune cells use to distinguish self from non-self. When a root detects compounds that match its own genetic signature closely, it responds differently than when it detects compounds from an unrelated plant. According to research by plant physiologist Richard Carbon at the University of California, Davis sagebrush plants can distinguish between clippings from themselves, from genetic siblings, and from unrelated sagebrush plants, and they alter their defensive chemistry accordingly. More aggressive towards strangers, more tolerant of relatives. This isn't consciousness, but it is recognition. It's information processing leading to differential response based on genetic relatedness. And in crowded ecosystems, recognition matters, because cooperation has risks. If you're going to share resources, if you're going to invest in supporting another plant's growth, you need some assurance that you're not just feeding a competitor who will outgrow you and shade you out the moment they're strong enough. Kin selection solves this. By preferentially helping relatives, you're helping copies of your own genes, even if those genes are in another plant's body. The evolutionary math works out. The cost of sharing is offset by the increased survival of your genetic lineage. But kinship recognition isn't the only form of discrimination plants have evolved. Some partnerships cross species boundaries entirely, and they require an even more sophisticated form of recognition. Let's go deeper, into the mycorrhizal networks. Mycorrhizae, the word means fungus root, are partnerships between plant roots and fungi that have existed for at least 400 million years, possibly longer. The fungus grows into or around the root cells. The plant provides carbon, sugars from photosynthesis. The fungus provides nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, that its thread-like hyphae can mine from soil far more efficiently than roots alone. But here's what makes this remarkable. A single fungal network can connect to dozens, hundreds, even thousands of different plants, different species, different ages, different genetic lineages, all linked through the same underground web of fungal threads. This isn't just a one-to-one partnership, it's a network, and networks can do things that individuals cannot. Research, published in 2025 by mycologist Toby Keers at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, revealed that mycorrhizal fungi don't just passively transport nutrients between connected plants. They regulate the flow. They control which plants get how much based on a complex economy of exchange. Plants that provide more carbon to the fungal network receive more nutrients in return. But it's not a simple one-to-one trade. The fungi integrate information across the entire network. A tree that's shaded and producing less sugar doesn't immediately get cut off. The network supports it for a while, as if there's a memory, a buffer, an understanding that conditions fluctuate and partnerships have value beyond immediate transaction. But if a plant consistently takes more than it gives, if it becomes parasitic on the network, the fungi respond. They reduce nutrient flow to that plant. They may sever connections entirely and reallocate resources to more cooperative partners. The network is managing fairness, enforcing reciprocity. And plants have evolved to participate in this system not because they're altruistic, but because access to the network provides advantages that isolated growth cannot match. A plant connected to a mycorrhizal network has access to nutrients from a much larger volume of soil than its own roots could ever explore. It receives warning signals when herbivores attack distant plants, chemical messages transmitted through the fungal threads that trigger defensive responses before the threat arrives. It can even receive carbon from neighbouring plants during times of stress, essentially borrowing resources from the community bank. But to access these benefits, it has to play by the rules. It has to contribute. It has to share. This is the infrastructure of coexistence, not just tolerance, but active exchange mediated by a third party, the fungal network, that benefits from maintaining the health of the entire plant community. And once this infrastructure exists, once plants are connected and communicating, stranger behaviours become possible. Some plants nurse others, literally. In harsh environments, deserts, alpine zones, recently disturbed areas, certain pioneer species create what ecologists call nurse plant effects. A single shrub or tree establishes itself in difficult conditions, modifies the microclimate beneath its canopy, enriches the soil with leaf litter, provides shade and wind protection. Other species, ones that couldn't survive in open conditions, germinate and grow in the shelter of the nurse plant. Mesquite trees in the Sonoran Desert do this. Acacia trees in African savannas do this. Nurse logs, fallen trees slowly decomposing, do this in temperate rainforests, becoming gardens for dozens of species that take root in their slowly rotting wood. Is this cooperation? The nurse plant isn't actively choosing to help, it's just living, and its presence creates opportunities for others, but evolution has shaped this interaction. According to research by community ecologist Reagan Calloway at the University of Montana, some nurse plants have evolved traits that make them better nurses: denser canopies that provide more shade, deeper roots that bring up nutrients from depth, and deposit them near the surface through leaf fall, chemical signatures that suppress competition from grasses but tolerate presence of diverse understory species. These traits have costs. A denser canopy means less light reaches the nurse plant's own lower branches. Bringing up deep nutrients benefits others as much as yourself. Tolerating understory plants means sharing water and space. But the benefits of nursing outweigh the costs, because plants that create diverse communities beneath their canopy are buffered against disturbances. Fire is less likely to reach them when surrounded by less flammable species. Herbivores are diluted across more targets. Soil health improves with diversity, supporting the nurse plant's own long-term growth. The nurse isn't being altruistic. It's building a community that increases its own survival odds. But the effect is the same: cooperation, investment in others' success because it creates conditions for mutual benefit. This pattern repeats across ecosystems. In tropical forests, certain tree species, Cecropia, Inga, Erythrina, grow fast, establish quickly in clearings, and create microclimates beneath their canopies where slower-growing, shade-tolerant species can establish. The pioneers will eventually be overtopped and shaded out by the very species they sheltered. They're temporary, but their genes persist because their strategy, grow fast, create opportunity, reproduce before being replaced, works in disturbed environments. They're trading long-term dominance for short-term success, and in the process, they're facilitating the restoration of forest complexity. But all of this, kin recognition, mycorrhizal networks, nurse plant effects, assumes that plants are at least somewhat rooted in place, that they're not directly on top of each other, that there's some minimal space between individuals. What happens when there isn't? What happens when plants are so densely packed that their roots tangle, their canopies overlap, their branches physically touch? Then cooperation requires a different strategy, one that looks less like resource sharing and more like communication. And plants, it turns out, are talking, not in words, not in sound, but in chemicals released into the air and soil, messages that other plants can receive and respond to. Let's follow one of these conversations, because it reveals something fundamental about how sharing space requires sharing information. In 1983, ecologists David Rhodes and Gordon Orions were studying willow trees in Washington state when they noticed something odd. When caterpillars attacked one tree, nearby trees that hadn't been touched, began producing defensive chemicals in their leaves, as if they'd been warned. At the time, this seemed impossible. Plants don't have nervous systems. They can't send signals the way animals do. The observation was dismissed, labelled anomalous, filed away as probably an artifact of experimental error, but it kept happening. Other researchers found similar patterns in different species: tomatoes, tobacco, sagebrush, maple trees. Always the same basic phenomenon: damage to one plant triggering defensive responses in undamaged neighbours. By the early 2000s, the evidence was undeniable. Plants were communicating, and the mechanism was surprisingly sophisticated. When an insect chews on a leaf, it doesn't just physically damage tissue. It triggers a cascade of chemical responses inside the plant. Jasmonic acid levels spike, gene expression changes. Within minutes, the plant begins synthesizing defensive compounds, alkaloids, tannins, protease inhibitors, that make its leaves less nutritious, harder to digest, sometimes actively toxic to herbivores. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of those defensive compounds are volatile. They evaporate. They drift into the air as scent molecules: green leaf volatiles, terpenoids, methyl salicylate. We experience these as smell, the scent of cut grass, the smell of tomato plants, pine forest aroma. We thought these were waste products, or maybe just pleasant accidents of plant chemistry. We were wrong. They're signals. Neighbouring plants have receptors that detect these airborne compounds. When a tomato plant smells the distress signals from an attack neighbour, it responds as if it's under attack itself. It activates the same defensive pathways, produces the same protective chemicals, becomes less palatable to insects before they even arrive. According to research published in 2024 by plant ecologist Richard Carbon at UC Davis, sagebrush plants that received airborne signals from clipped neighbours had 50% less herbivore damage over the following weeks compared to plants that were isolated from these chemical messages. The plants were eavesdropping on each other's distress, and using that information to prepare their own defences. This changes the economics of plant defence. Maintaining chemical defences is expensive. It costs energy and nutrients that could otherwise go into growth and reproduction. Most plants keep their defences relatively low until they detect a threat, then ramp up production. But threats spread. If one plant in a meadow is being eaten by locusts, there's a good chance neighbouring plants will be next. The insects will move through the area systematically. So when a plant receives a warning signal from a neighbour, it's receiving actionable intelligence. Advance warning that allows it to prepare defences before damage occurs. This benefits the signaller too. An herbivore that encounters a field of defended plants is less likely to stay in that area, less likely to return to the original plant for a second meal. By warning its neighbours, a damaged plant creates a hostile environment for the herbivore, increasing the odds that the attack will end. It's a form of collective defence, not coordinated through any central control, but emerging from individual plants responding to chemical information, creating a wave of resistance that spreads faster than the threat itself. But here's where this gets truly strange. The signals aren't always honest. Some plants cheat. Dodder cuscuta species is a parasitic plant. It has no roots of its own, no chlorophyll, no ability to photosynthesize. It grows as an orange vine that wraps around host plants, sinks feeding structures called haustoria into their stems, and steals water, nutrients, and sugars directly from their vascular systems. Dodder is good at this. It can drain multiple host plants simultaneously, spreading through a garden or field like a strangling web. But it's picky. Some hosts are more nutritious than others. Tomatoes are better than wheat. Beans are better than grass. So how does Dodder, a plant with no eyes and no nervous system, choose the best hosts? It smells them. Research by plant physiologist Consuelo de Moraes at Penn State University revealed that germinating dodder seedlings can detect volatile organic compounds released by nearby plants. Different species release different blends of compounds. The dodder analyzes these chemical signatures and grows toward the most nutritious hosts, avoiding less valuable ones. It's using the same chemical communication system that plants evolved for warning each other, but it's exploiting it. Listening to the chemical advertisements plants broadcast and using that information to parasitize them more efficiently. This creates evolutionary pressure. Plants that are too honest, too loud with their chemical signals, become easier targets for parasites and specialized herbivores. But plants that go silent, that stop participating in the warning system, lose the benefits of collective defense. The result is a kind of arms race, but one that doesn't end in total deception. Most plants still signal. They still respond to warnings, because the benefits of cooperation, reduced herbivory, collective resistance, outweigh the risks of being exploited by the occasional parasite. And the communication network gets more complex, because plants aren't just broadcasting warnings about herbivores, they're sharing information about water stress, nutrient availability, competition for light. They're creating a chemical commons, an information space that all plants in the community can access and contribute to. Some trees even appear to remember these interactions. Research published in 2025 by forest ecologist Suzanne Simard showed that Douglas fir trees that had previously received carbon support through mycorrhizal networks from neighbouring birch trees were more likely to reciprocate years later when the birches were stressed and shaded. The firs sent carbon back, not immediately, not as a direct transaction, but as if there was a memory of past assistance embedded in the pattern of network connections. This is reciprocal altruism. The same kind of behaviour we see in social animals, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but implemented through fungal networks and chemical gradients instead of memory and recognition. It works because plants are long-lived. A tree can stand in the same spot for centuries. It will interact with the same neighbours, the same mycorrhizal networks, the same local community for its entire life. Under those conditions, cooperation becomes stable. Cheaters can be identified and punished, cut off from network resources, shaded out, chemically suppressed. Cooperators are rewarded with access, support, integration into the collective resource pool. The community becomes self-regulating, not through conscious enforcement, but through the accumulated consequences of repeated interactions over decades and centuries. But chemical communication has limits. It's slow, it's diffuse. Signals degrade with distance and time. For plants that need to respond quickly to immediate physical contact, To the press of a neighbouring root or the shade of an overhanging branch, chemistry isn't fast enough. They need something else, something more direct, and they have it. Plants can feel, not with nerves, not with the kind of touch receptors animals have, but with mechanosensation, the ability to detect physical pressure and respond to it at the cellular level. When a root encounters an obstacle, a rock, another root, compacted soil, it doesn't just stop growing. It responds. Cells on one side of the root tip produce different hormones than cells on the other side. This creates differential growth. The root curves, navigates around the obstacle, finds the path of least resistance. This is how roots explore soil. By feeling their way through the three-dimensional matrix of particles and pores and other organisms, constantly adjusting direction based on physical feedback. But here's what makes this relevant to sharing space. Roots can distinguish between their own roots and the roots of other plants. They can feel the difference. When a plant's root encounters another root from the same individual, it tends to avoid it, growing away, preventing itself from competing with itself for the same resources. But when it encounters a root from a different plant, the response is more variable. According to research by plant physiologist Monica Galliano at the University of Western Australia, some plants grow more aggressively when they detect competitor roots nearby, investing more in root proliferation to claim soil volume before the competitor does. Other plants, particularly closely related individuals, show reduced aggression. They divide the space more evenly, each plant claiming its territory without excessive overlap. It's negotiation through growth. Not verbal, not conscious, but effective. Two plants encountering each other underground feel each other's presence through mechanical signals, chemical gradients, and patterns of resource depletion, then adjust their growth accordingly to minimize destructive competition. This works best when plants are evenly matched. When both have similar resource requirements, similar growth rates, similar competitive ability. Under those conditions, fighting is costly for both parties. It's more efficient to divide the space and coexist. But when plants are mismatched, when one has a significant advantage, cooperation breaks down. Invasive species exploit this. They grow faster, produce more roots, shade more aggressively than native species that evolved in the same community and learned to share. The natives respond as if they're interacting with cooperators, dividing space, moderating aggression. The invasive responds as if it's in virgin territory, growing without restraint, taking everything it can reach. Garlic mustard, Alearia petiolata, does this in North American forests. It's a European plant that was introduced in the 1800s and has since spread across the eastern United States. It produces chemicals that suppress native mycorrhizal fungi, severing the underground networks that native plants depend on for nutrient sharing. Then, it grows in dense monocultures, crowding out everything else. The native plants don't have an evolutionary history with garlic mustard. They haven't developed defenses against its specific chemistry. They can't compete with its aggressive growth. The cooperative strategies that worked for millions of years in stable communities fail when a non-cooperator enters the system. This reveals something fundamental about plant cooperation. It's not universal, it's not unconditional. It evolved in specific contexts, between specific species, under specific selective pressures, and it can be broken, but it can also be restored, because even after disturbance, even after invasion, the mechanisms for cooperation are still there, encoded in plant genomes, waiting for conditions that make sharing advantageous again. Let's see how that happens. How communities rebuild after they've been destroyed. Stand in a field that's been abandoned for a year. Just 1 year since the last plough turned the soil, since crops were harvested, since human management stopped. The field is already changing. It's not bare, it's not empty. There are plants everywhere, but they're not the plants that will be there in 10 years, or 50, or 100. They're pioneers, annual weeds, fast growers with a specific evolutionary strategy. Get in first, reproduce quickly, dominate while the opportunity exists. Crabgrass, pigweed, lamb's quarters, ragweed, species that produce thousands of seeds, that germinate readily in disturbed soil, that can complete their entire life cycle in a single growing season. They're not built for longevity, they're built for speed, and they're not cooperating, not yet. This early stage of succession is pure competition, a race to claim space before someone else does. Root growth is aggressive. Chemical warfare is common. These plants suppress their neighbours with allelopathic compounds, toxins released into the soil that inhibit germination and growth of competing species. According to research published in 2024 by succession ecologist Richard Hobbs at the University of Western Australia, soil samples from recently disturbed fields show high concentrations of allelopathic compounds compared to mature ecosystems. The plants are chemically hostile to each other because there's no advantage yet to cooperation. Resources are abundant. Space is open. The limiting factor is time. Who can grow fastest and set seed before the season ends? But this can't last, because annual plants by definition die every year. They don't persist. They don't accumulate biomass. They don't build soil structure. They extract nutrients and return them only when they decompose. And even then, much of what they absorbed is locked in seeds that may blow away or be eaten. The system is leaking resources. Nitrogen washes out with rain. Organic matter doesn't accumulate. The soil stays poor. And into this poverty, a different kind of plant arrives. Perennials, plants that live for multiple years, that invest in root systems instead of just seed production, that begin to accumulate resources in the soil rather than constantly extracting them. Grasses start appearing in year 2 or 3. Not the annual grasses that dominated initially, but perennial species, switchgrass, bluestem, fescue. Their roots go deep. They don't die back completely in winter. They hold soil in place, preventing erosion. When their leaves die, the organic matter stays local, decomposing in place, beginning to build humus, and with the grasses come legumes. Clover, vetch, wild indigo, the nitrogen fixers. This is the turning point. This is when cooperation starts to outcompete pure competition. The legumes aren't more aggressive than the annuals. They're slower growing actually, but they have an advantage the annuals don't. Partnership with bacteria that can pull nitrogen from the atmosphere. In poor soil, where nitrogen is the limiting nutrient, this is a game changer. Legumes establish, they grow, they fix nitrogen. And that nitrogen, as we discussed earlier, doesn't stay locked in the legume. It leaks into the soil. It becomes available to neighbouring plants. Research by ecosystem ecologist David Tillman at the University of Minnesota tracked nitrogen levels in abandoned agricultural fields over 30 years. In fields where legumes established early, total soil nitrogen increased by 40–60% within the first decade. In fields where legumes failed to establish, nitrogen remained depleted, succession stalled, and annual weeds continued to dominate for much longer. The legumes are fertilizing their competitors, but in doing so, they're transforming the community into something more stable, more productive, more resilient, and they benefit from that transformation. Here's why. As soil nitrogen increases, plant diversity increases. More species can establish because the fundamental nutrient limitation has been lifted. Grasses grow denser, forbs appear, wildflowers, broadleaf perennials, shrubs begin germinating in the increasingly shaded understory. And as plant diversity increases, so does the diversity of mycorrhizal fungi, soil bacteria, insects, birds, mammals. The system becomes more complex, more interconnected. Legumes growing in diverse communities are less vulnerable to specialized herbivores than legumes growing in monoculture. The herbivores have more options, more targets, so pressure on any single species decreases. Legumes in diverse communities have access to larger mycorrhizal networks, giving them better drought resistance and nutrient uptake efficiency. They're buffered against disturbance. The cost of sharing nitrogen is offset by the benefits of living in a more stable, more diverse ecosystem. This is community-level selection, not individual plants being altruistic, but individual plants whose genes code for behaviors that create community structures that increase the survival odds of those genes, and succession continues. The pioneer perennials, the grasses and legumes and early forbs, create conditions that allow the next wave of species to establish. Shrubs appear, sumac, dogwood, blackberry. Species that couldn't have survived in the harsh conditions of bare soil and full sun, but that thrive in the partial shade and improved soil structure created by the herbaceous layer. The shrubs grow taller. Then the herbs, they shade them. You might think this would be devastating for the plants that created the conditions the shrubs needed, and for some individuals it is. They die back in the shade. But the population persists, because shrubs are patchy. They create a mosaic of a light and shadow, sunny gaps between shrub clusters where herbs still thrive, and the herb's seeds are still in the soil, waiting. They can persist for decades as seed banks, germinating whenever a disturbance creates an opening. The herbs didn't just facilitate the shrubs, they created a community structure that allows both to coexist in a dynamic equilibrium. And the shrubs in turn facilitate the next wave, trees. Tree seedlings are vulnerable. They grow slowly in their first years. They need protection from browsing deer, from desiccation in full sun, from competition with fast-growing herbs. Shrubs provide that protection. A tree seedling germinating in the shelter of a blackberry thicket has a much higher survival rate than one germinating in open field. According to research by restoration ecologist Robin Chasden at the University of Connecticut, tree establishment in tropical secondary forests is up to 80% higher in areas with dense shrub cover, compared to areas that went directly from grass to scattered trees. The shrubs are nurse plants. They're creating the microclimate conditions that allow the forest to return. But they're also sealing their own fate, because trees, once established, will overtop them, will shade them out, will dominate the canopy for centuries. The shrubs are temporary. They know this, in the sense that their genome has been shaped by millions of years of playing this exact role. They're not building a permanent empire, they're building the conditions for their own replacement. But their genes persist because this strategy works in disturbed landscapes. Shrubs are the bridge between grassland and forest. They're essential to succession, and as long as disturbances keep happening, fires, windstorms, human clearing, there will always be new opportunities for pioneer shrubs to establish, thrive briefly, and facilitate the return of complexity. This is the temporal dimension of sharing space. Not all species can occupy the same place at the same time, but they can occupy it sequentially, each phase creating the conditions for the next, each species contributing to a trajectory that leads toward increasing diversity and stability. The climax forest, the theoretical endpoint of succession, isn't a static collection of species. It's a dynamic mosaic of different successional stages maintained by small-scale disturbances. A tree falls, creating a gap. Light reaches the forest floor. Herbs germinate. Shrubs establish. Young trees compete for the opening. Eventually one wins, closes the canopy, and the cycle begins again somewhere else. The forest is constantly recycling through these stages at the scale of individual treefall gaps. The cooperation isn't universal. It's local, specific, contingent on position in the successional sequence and spatial location in the landscape. But zoom out, look at the whole forest over decades and centuries, and you see something remarkable. The total biomass increases, the total carbon stored increases, the total nutrient capital locked in living and dead organic matter increases. The system is building complexity from simple beginnings, and it's doing it through a sequence of facilitations where each wave of colonists creates opportunities for the next. This is niche construction. Organisms don't just adapt to their environment, they modify it, and those modifications feed back to change which organisms can survive there. Beavers do this when they build dams, transforming streams into ponds and creating habitat for dozens of species that couldn't exist in flowing water. Earthworms do this when they process soil, changing its structure and chemistry in ways that benefit plants. Humans do this when we build cities, creating entirely novel ecosystems that select for pigeons and rats and cockroaches. But plants have been doing this longer than any animal. Since they first colonized land 470 million years ago, they've been transforming rock into soil, bare ground into forest, simple systems into complex ones. And the mechanism is often facilitation, earlier species creating conditions that later species require. But facilitation has limits. It works when there's a clear successional trajectory, when pioneer species are reliably replaced by later species that create more stable communities. It breaks down when that trajectory is interrupted. Fire can do this. In fire-adapted ecosystems, chaparral, savanna, boreal forest, succession doesn't lead to a closed canopy forest. It leads to a fire which resets the system back to early stages. The plants in these systems have evolved for this cycle. They regenerate from fire. Some even require fire to germinate. But introduce fire to a system that didn't evolve with it, or suppress fire in a system that requires it, and succession derails. Species that should be temporary become permanent. Species that should dominate never establish. The community gets stuck in an intermediate state that's neither early successional nor mature. The same thing happens with invasive species. When a non-native plant establishes and dominates, it can arrest succession. Kudzu in the southeastern United States does this. It grows over everything: shrubs, young trees, even mature trees, covering them in a dense mat of vines that prevents photosynthesis and eventually kills them. The forest succession that should proceed from field to shrubland to young forest to mature forest stops at the shrubland stage, buried under kudzu. The facilitation mechanism is still there. Shrubs are still creating shade and soil structure, but the beneficiaries aren't native trees, it's kudzu. And kudzu doesn't facilitate the next stage, it just perpetuates itself. This is a cooperation system being hijacked. The native plants evolved in a community where shrubs temporarily dominated, then gave way to trees. The succession pathway was reliable enough that it was worth investing in strategies that facilitated it. But kudzu didn't evolve in that system. It has no evolutionary history of being replaced. It exploits the facilitation it receives and gives nothing back to the trajectory toward complexity. Breaking these arrested successions requires intervention, removing the invasive species, reintroducing native plants, sometimes physically destroying the community and forcing it back to bare ground so succession can start again with native pioneers. But when succession works, when the facilitation cascade proceeds uninterrupted, the result is something extraordinary. A mature forest where hundreds of species coexist in the same space, each occupying a slightly different niche, each contributing to the collective properties that make the whole system more than the sum of its parts. And in those mature systems, cooperation becomes even more sophisticated, because it's not just about facilitation anymore, it's about active management of shared resources. Let's go back underground, to the mycorrhizal networks, because in mature forests, those networks are doing something that looks almost like governance. The fungal network beneath a mature forest isn't a passive plumbing system, it's making decisions, not conscious decisions, not deliberate choices in any sense we'd recognize as intentional, but decisions nonetheless, allocations of resources based on information integration across the entire network, responses that shape which plants thrive and which struggle, enforcement of reciprocity that maintains the stability of the whole system. To understand how this works, we need to understand what the fungi are getting out of this arrangement. Mycorrhizal fungi can't photosynthesize. They have no chlorophyll, no ability to capture energy from sunlight. They're entirely dependent on plants for carbon, sugars, lipids, organic compounds that plants produce through photosynthesis and export to their roots. A plant allocates 10–30% of all the carbon it fixes to feeding its fungal partners. That's enormous. That's more than most plants spend on reproduction. It only makes sense if the fungi are providing something equally valuable in return. And they are. Nutrients, especially phosphorus. Phosphorus is strange. It's absolutely essential for life. It's in DNA, in ATP, in cell membranes, but it's almost always limiting in terrestrial ecosystems. Not because there isn't enough phosphorus in rocks and soil. There is, but most of it is locked in forms plants can't access. Bound in minerals, complexed with calcium or iron, trapped in organic compounds that require specific enzymes to break down. Plant roots are relatively large. They can't access the tiny pores in soil where phosphorus accumulates. They can't produce the full range of enzymes needed to liberate phosphorus from all its chemical forms. Fungal hyphae can. They're microscopic, 1/10 the diameter of the smallest root hair. They penetrate pores that roots can't reach. They produce enzymes that break down organic phosphorus. They even dissolve rock minerals through acids they secrete, liberating inorganic phosphorus directly from the parent material. A plant connected to a mycorrhizal network has access to phosphorus from a volume of soil hundreds to thousands of times larger than what its roots alone could explore. This is why the partnership exists. This is why plants pay the carbon cost. But here's where it gets complex. A single fungal network connects many plants, dozens, hundreds. Sometimes different species, different ages, different resource needs. The fungus is collecting carbon from all of them and distributing phosphorus to all of them. How does it decide who gets what? Research published in 2025 by mycologist Toby Keers at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam used isotope labeling to track resource flows through mycorrhizal networks in real time. they found that the fungus doesn't distribute phosphorus equally. It allocates more to plants that provide more carbon. This makes sense. It's a market. The fungus trades phosphorus for carbon, and like any trader, it directs more resources toward its best partners. But the relationship isn't purely transactional. The fungus also maintains connections to plants that are temporarily providing less carbon, young trees in deep shade, mature trees going through a drought, individuals recovering from herbivore damage. These plants aren't immediately profitable partners. They're taking more than they're giving. Why doesn't the fungus cut them off? Because networks have value beyond immediate exchange. A diverse network is more resilient. If the fungus depends entirely on a few highly productive plants and those plants die, from disease, wind damage, insect outbreak, the fungus loses its carbon supply. But if it maintains connections to many plants across different species and age classes, it has redundancy, insurance against catastrophic loss. The fungus is investing in stability. It's buffering short-term losses against long-term survival. And there's another dimension to this. The fungus benefits when the overall productivity of the plant community increases. More plants, more photosynthesis, more total carbon available to trade for. So the fungus has an evolutionary incentive to maintain the health of the entire system, not just maximize extraction from individual plants. This creates something that looks remarkably like commons management. The network is a shared resource pool. Plants contribute carbon. They withdraw phosphorus and nitrogen. The fungus regulates the flows to prevent overexploitation and maintain the productivity of the pool. Plants that consistently take more than they give face consequences. The fungus reduces their phosphorus allocation. It may sever connections entirely, cutting off their access to the network. Other plants, sensing the reduced competition for fungal services, may increase their own investment in the partnership, providing more carbon to gain preferential access. The system self-regulates through distributed feedback loops. No central authority, no enforcement agency, just individual actors, plants and fungi, responding to local conditions in ways that happen to maintain the stability of the whole. But this only works if cheating is punished, if there are mechanisms to detect and respond to exploitation, and there are. Fungi can sense the carbon concentration in their own tissues. When a plant reduces its carbon export to the fungus experiences a local decrease in sugar availability in the hyphae connected to that plant. It responds by growing fewer hyphae toward that plant and reallocating growth toward plants providing more carbon. Plants can sense the phosphorus concentration in their roots. When a fungus reduces phosphorus delivery, the plant experiences nutrient stress. It responds by reducing its carbon allocation to that fungus and potentially forming new partnerships with other fungal species. Both parties have mechanisms to detect defection and retaliate. This creates a stable equilibrium where cooperation is maintained not through trust or altruism, but through mutual monitoring and reciprocal enforcement. It's the biological equivalent of a contract, backed not by law, but by the ability of each party to walk away and find a better partner. But contracts require information. You need to know what your partner is providing relative to what they could provide. You need to know if better partners are available. You need to be able to distinguish good faith effort from intentional exploitation. How do plants and fungi get this information? Through the network itself. Because the network isn't just transporting nutrients and carbon, it's transporting signals, chemical messages that propagate through fungal hyphae faster than they could diffuse through soil, information about herbivore attacks, pathogen presence, water stress, nutrient availability. When one tree in a network is attacked by insects, it produces defensive compounds and volatile signals. Some of those signals are absorbed by fungal hyphae and transported to other trees in the network. Those trees receive the warning and activate their own defenses before the insects arrive. According to research by forest ecologist Suzanne Simard, this network communication reduces herbivore damage across connected plant communities by 20–40% compared to isolated individuals. The plants are collectively more defended because they're sharing threat information in real time. But the information flow isn't random. It's structured by the network architecture. Trees that are more strongly connected to the network, trees with more fungal partners, more hyphal connections, more investment in the mycorrhizal relationship, receive more information and receive it faster. The network has a topology. There are hubs, large old trees with extensive fungal connections, and there are peripheral nodes, young trees, small individuals, recent colonists with limited network integration. Hubs play a disproportionate role in network function. They're the central switchboards, the integration points where information from many sources flows together. When a hub tree dies, network connectivity decreases dramatically. Peripheral trees that were connected to each other primarily through that hub become isolated. Information flow slows, resource sharing decreases. Research published in 2024 by network ecologist Kevin Byler at the University of British Columbia mapped the mycorrhizal network structure in old-growth forests and found that removing hub trees, through logging, wind throw or disease, reduced network connectivity by 50–70%, even when the total number of trees removed was less than 10% of the forest. The network isn't egalitarian. Some nodes are more important than others, and those important nodes are usually the oldest, largest trees in the forest, the individuals that have had the longest time to build relationships, establish connections, become integrated into the community. This creates a kind of gerontocracy. The old trees, by virtue of their extensive network connections, have more influence over resource distribution. They can support or suppress younger trees by directing fungal resources toward or away from them. There's evidence they use this influence to support their own offspring. As we discussed earlier, trees recognize kin and preferentially share resources with relatives. But the mechanism isn't just direct root-to-root transfer, it's mediated through the fungal network. An old tree with extensive network access can direct resources toward its seedlings more effectively than an isolated tree with limited connections. This creates an advantage for seedlings that establish near their parent trees. They have better network access. They receive more support during the vulnerable establishment phase. They're more likely to survive. But it also means that networks can perpetuate dominance. If the offspring of hub trees have better survival rates, they're more likely to become hubs themselves in the next generation. The network structure becomes self-reinforcing, unless something disrupts it. Fire does this. In fire-adapted forests, periodic burns kill most young trees but often spare larger, older individuals with thick bark and high canopies. The network is disrupted. Hub trees lose many of their connections because the smaller trees they were connected to are gone. When new trees establish after the fire, they build new networks with different topologies, different hubs, different patterns of connection. Wind does this. Large trees are vulnerable to wind throw precisely because they're large, more surface area for wind to push against, more leverage at the base. When a hub tree falls, it tears up its root system and physically breaks fungal connections. The gap it leaves becomes colonization space for younger trees. Disease does this. Some pathogens specifically target large old trees. They're easier to find. They're often stressed from age-related decline. They represent huge resource payloads if successfully colonized. When disease kills hubs, network structure resets. Disturbance prevents any single network topology from becoming permanent. It creates turnover, and turnover creates opportunity for less connected individuals to increase their integration, for new species to establish, for the community composition to shift. This is important because networks, despite their benefits, can also enforce conformity. If resource access requires network membership, and network membership requires reciprocal exchange with fungi, then plants that can't or don't form mycorrhizal partnerships are excluded from the community. Some plant families don't form mycorrhizae. Brassicaceae, the mustard family, which includes garlic mustard, the invasive species we discussed earlier, Chenopodiaceae, the goosefoot family, which includes many weedy species. These plants have alternative strategies for phosphorus acquisition. They produce different root exudates, different enzymes, different mobilization mechanisms. In ecosystems with strong mycorrhizal networks, non-mycorrhizal plants are at a disadvantage. They can't access network resources. They're competing purely as individuals against an integrated collective. But in disturbed systems, in degraded soils, in environments where mycorrhizal fungi are absent or suppressed, non-mycorrhizal plants have an advantage. They don't pay the carbon cost of supporting fungi. They can invest that energy in faster growth, more reproduction, more competitive aggression. This is part of why invasive species are often non-mycorrhizal. They're adapted for colonization of disturbed habitats where network benefits are minimal. and the costs of supporting fungi would be a liability. But it also means that restoring mycorrhizal networks is a strategy for controlling invasives. If you can re-establish fungal populations and rebuild network connectivity, native plants gain a collective advantage that individual invasives can't match. This is being tested in restoration projects across North America. Researchers are inoculating degraded sites with native mycorrhizal fungi, planting diverse native plant communities to maximize network formation, and finding that invasion resistance increases as network complexity increases. The network is a defense, not against herbivores or pathogens, but against disruption, against the loss of diversity that occurs when competitive dominance or invasive species monopolize resources. By sharing resources through networks, plant communities create emergent properties, stability, resilience, resistance, that no individual plant could achieve alone. But emergence requires more than just connection. It requires the right kind of connection, the right balance between cooperation and competition. Too much cooperation, and the system becomes vulnerable to cheaters. Too much competition, and it collapses into low diversity dominance by the most aggressive species. Finding that balance is what evolution has been doing in plant communities for hundreds of millions of years, and the solutions it's found are often surprising, sometimes even beautiful. Let's look at one more example, one more way plants have learned to share space. Because this one reveals something fundamental about the limits of competition and the necessity of cooperation in a finite world. There's a mathematical problem that ecologists have been wrestling with since the 1960s. It's called the paradox of the plankton, and it goes like this. In any body of water, dozens or even hundreds of species of phytoplankton coexist. They're all photosynthesizing. They're all competing for the same basic resources: sunlight, nitrogen, phosphorus, trace minerals. The water is thoroughly mixed by currents, so there's no spatial separation. They're all in the same place, using the same resources at the same time. According to classical competition theory, this shouldn't be possible. The competitive exclusion principle states that two species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist indefinitely. One will be slightly better at acquiring that resource. It will grow faster. It will outcompete and exclude the other. Eventually you should end up with one winner. Maybe a handful of winners if there are multiple limiting resources, and each species is best at acquiring a different one. But you don't get a handful. You get hundreds, all coexisting, all persisting, year after year. For decades, this was considered a paradox, an unexplained violation of fundamental ecological theory. The solution, when it finally emerged, turned out to be about time, about the fact that environments aren't static. Resources fluctuate, seasons change. What's limiting in spring isn't what's limiting in summer. What's advantageous in warm water isn't advantageous in cold. Phytoplankton species have different optimal temperatures, different nutrient requirements, different life strategies. Some bloom early in spring when nutrients are high but light is low. Others dominate in summer when light is intense but nutrients are depleted. Still others persist through winter by growing slowly, maintaining populations until conditions improve. They're sharing the same space, but they're using it in shifts, temporal partitioning. Just like the meadow plants we discussed earlier that flower in different seasons. But there's another solution to the paradox, one that's less about time and more about space. Not large-scale spatial separations, different plants in different locations, but micro-scale, spatial structure, tiny differences in position that create huge differences in the environment each individual experiences. In forests, this microscale structure is everywhere. The canopy isn't uniform. It's a mosaic of gaps and patches. A large tree creates deep shade directly beneath its crown, but light streams through gaps between neighbouring trees. A tree that falls creates a bright opening that might persist for years or close, rapidly depending on what's growing around it. Two tree seedlings a metre apart can experience completely different light environments. One in a gap, getting full sun, growing fast, producing maximum photosynthesis. The other in shade, barely surviving, waiting for the tree above it to die, or for a branch to fall and open the canopy. These microenvironments create micro-niches, and micro-niches allow species to coexist even when they have overlapping resource requirements at the large scale. According to research published in 2024 by forest ecologist Stephen Pacala at Princeton University. Tropical rainforests maintain high diversity partly because of this fine-scale environmental heterogeneity. At the scale of the whole forest, many tree species seem to have identical niches. They all need light, water, nutrients. But at the scale of individual trees, each one is experiencing a unique combination of canopy position, soil chemistry, mycorrhizal partners, herbivore pressure, and neighbour identity. No two trees are in exactly the same environment, so no two trees are competing in exactly the same way. The competition is diffused across this multidimensional niche space, and no single species can dominate all the possible combinations. This is one answer to how 200 species coexist in a square metre of rainforest floor. They're not all doing the same thing. They're occupying different positions in a high-dimensional resource space that looks uniform to us, but is actually fractured into thousands of distinct micro-niches. But there's a limit to this explanation, because micro-niches, no matter how finely divided, are still finite. There's only so much variation in light, soil chemistry, moisture, temperature within a small area. Eventually you run out of dimensions to partition. Eventually species start overlapping too much, and competition becomes destructive. Unless there's another mechanism. One that doesn't just divide resources but actually generates new resources. That increases the total amount available to share, and plants do this through a process called niche construction. They don't just occupy niches, they create them. Tree roots don't just extract nutrients from soil, they create soil. They exude organic compounds that feed bacteria and fungi. Those microbes break down rock minerals, mobilizing nutrients that weren't previously available. They produce enzymes that decompose organic matter, releasing nitrogen and phosphorus locked in dead plant and animal tissues. The zone of soil directly surrounding a root, the rhizosphere, has 10 to 100 times more microbial activity than bulk soil just a few millimeters away. It's a hotspot of nutrient cycling, driven by the carbon the plant is pumping into the ground. Each plant is creating its own soil environment, and that environment persists even after the plant dies. The microbial communities it cultivated continue functioning. The organic compounds it deposited continue affecting soil chemistry. The structure it created, pore spaces opened by roots, aggregates bound by fungal hyphae, continues influencing water movement and aeration. Over time, different plant species create different soil environments. A coniferous forest has acidic soil with thick organic layers and slow decomposition. A deciduous forest has more neutral pH, faster nutrient cycling, more mixing of organic and mineral layers. A grassland has dense root mats in the top few inches and high organic matter content. These aren't just differences in which plants happen to grow in which soils. The plants are creating the soils they thrive in. This is a feedback loop. Plant influences soil. Soil influences which plants can grow. Those plants further modify the soil, and the system converges on a stable state, a plant-soil community that reinforces itself. But here's where it gets interesting for coexistence. Different plants create different soils. So in a diverse plant community, you get diverse soil environments at small spatial scales. A patch under an oak tree has different chemistry than a patch under a pine tree 10 meters away. This creates spatial structure in what was originally uniform substrate. The plants themselves are generating the heterogeneity that allows them to coexist. Research by soil ecologist Richard Bargett at the University of Manchester in 2025 showed that removing plant diversity from experimental plots caused soil chemistry to homogenize within 2 years. Without different plant species creating different rhizosphere environments, the soil became uniform. And once the soil was uniform, plant diversity decreased further because there were fewer distinct niches to occupy. It's a positive feedback. Diversity creates heterogeneity. Heterogeneity supports diversity, but negative feedbacks exist too, and they're equally important for maintaining coexistence. Plant soil feedbacks can be negative when a plant's own species-specific pathogens and herbivores accumulate in the soil around it. A tree growing in soil where its own species has been abundant develops a population of specialized enemies, root-feeding nematodes, pathogenic fungi, seed predators that specifically target that species. Seedlings trying to establish near their parent tree encounter this hostile soil biota. They suffer higher mortality than seedlings of other species establishing in the same location. This is called the Jansen-Connell effect, named after the ecologist who first proposed it in the 1970s. It's a mechanism that prevents any single species from dominating an area. The more abundant a species becomes locally, the more its enemies accumulate, and the harder it becomes for its offspring to survive nearby. This creates spacing. Trees of the same species are pushed apart by their shared enemies. The gaps between them are filled by other species that don't share those enemies. According to research by tropical ecologist Liza Kometa at Yale University, the Jansen-Connell effect is strongest in diverse tropical forests and weakest in low-diversity temperate forests. In the tropics, where each tree species is relatively rare and specialized enemies can accumulate, negative feedbacks are powerful enough to prevent competitive dominance. In temperate zones, where tree diversity is lower and generalist enemies are more common, the effect is weaker. This might explain why tropical forests are so diverse, not because the tropics have intrinsically more niches, but because negative feedbacks prevent dominance, creating space for rare species to persist. The soil is acting as a regulatory mechanism. It remembers which species have grown in each spot and penalizes repetition. This memory creates pressure for diversity, for different species to occupy each patch as it cycles through generations. But memory fades. Pathogens die. Nematodes disperse. After a tree dies and its stump rots, the soil gradually loses the signature of that species. Eventually, a seedling of the same species can establish there again, without facing accumulated enemies. The timescale of this forgetting varies. Some pathogens persist for decades, others disappear within years. The result is a spatial pattern where conspecifics, members of the same species, are more evenly spaced than random, maintained at minimum distances by the ghosts of their ancestors still haunting the soil. This is cooperation of a strange kind. It's not active sharing, it's enforced diversity through negative feedback. But the effect is the same, preventing dominance, maintaining heterogeneity, allowing more species to coexist than competition theory would predict. And it creates resilience, because a forest where no single species can dominate is a forest that's resistant to catastrophic collapse. If a pathogen wipes out one species, the rest continue. If a drought stresses one functional group, others compensate. The diversity itself is a form of insurance, but insurance requires that the different species are actually different, that they respond differently to stress, disturbance, environmental change. If all the species in a diverse community are essentially equivalent, doing the same things, requiring the same resources, responding identically to conditions, then diversity is just redundancy. It provides no functional benefit. For coexistence to matter, for sharing space to create emergent stability, the species have to be complementary. Their differences have to be functional, not just taxonomic. And in mature, plant communities they are. Some species have deep roots, accessing water from lower soil layers. Others have shallow roots, capturing surface moisture. Some fix nitrogen. Others accumulate phosphorus. Some grow fast and die young. Others grow slowly and live for centuries. Some tolerate shade. Others require full sun. Some flower in spring. Others in summer or fall. These differences aren't random. They're the product of millions of years of evolution in communities where sharing space was the only option, where learning to be different was the only path to persistence. The diversity we see in forests and meadows isn't just a catalogue of species that happen to occur together. It's a functional architecture, a division of labour, a complementarity that emerges from the simple fact that plants can't move, can't leave, can't escape their neighbours. They had to learn to share. And in learning to share, they built something none of them could build alone, a community more productive, more stable, more resilient than any monoculture. But we're still missing something. Because all of this, niche partitioning, facilitation, network sharing, negative feedbacks, assumes that cooperation is passive, that it emerges automatically from individual plants following their own genetic programming in a stable environment. What happens when the environment isn't stable? When conditions change faster than evolution can track? When disturbance exceeds the range the community was adapted for? Then cooperation requires something more, something that looks almost like learning, almost like memory, almost like collective intelligence, and the evidence suggests plants might have it. In 2008, ecologist Monica Galliano conducted an experiment that shouldn't have worked. She was studying Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, the species that folds its leaves when touched. It's a defensive response. The sudden movement startles herbivores, and the folded leaves are harder to eat. Galliano wanted to know if the plant could learn, if it could distinguish between a genuine threat and a harmless disturbance that it could safely ignore. She dropped the plants, repeatedly, from a height of about 6 inches, enough to trigger the leaf-folding response. The first drop caused the leaves to collapse, so did the second, and the third. But by the fourth or fifth drop, something changed. The plant stopped responding. The leaves stayed open. Not because the plant was damaged or exhausted. If you touched the leaves manually, they still folded immediately. The plant was still capable of responding. It just wasn't responding to the drops anymore. It had learned that drops were harmless, and it remembered. For weeks. Galliano tested the plants again 28 days later. They still didn't respond to drops. The memory persisted even though every cell in the plant had turned over multiple times, even though there was no obvious physical change that could encode the information. This shouldn't be possible. Learning requires a nervous system, or at least something analogous to one, a way to integrate information over time, to store it, to retrieve it, and use it to modify behavior. Plants don't have neurons, they don't have synapses, they don't have anything we'd recognize as a brain, but they have electrical signaling. Action potentials, like the ones in animal nerves, propagate through plant tissues when cells are stimulated. Calcium waves spread from damaged leaves to undamaged ones, triggering defensive responses. Pressure changes in the phloem, the vascular tissue that transports sugars, can carry information about water stress from roots to shoots. These signals move slowly compared to animal nerves, centimeters per second instead of meters per second, but they move, and they can be integrated over time. According to research published in 2024 by plant neurobiologist Stefano Mancuso at the University of Florence, plants use these electrical signals to coordinate responses across their entire body. A caterpillar chewing on one branch triggers electrical activity that spreads to other branches, activating defenses throughout the tree. Roots encountering a nutrient patch send signals to the shoot that modify carbon allocation, directing more sugars to the root system to exploit the resource. The plant is processing information, making decisions about resource allocation, adjusting behavior based on environmental feedback. But can it remember? Can it store information about past events and use that information to modify future responses? The mimosa experiment suggests yes, but the mechanism is unclear. There's no obvious physical structure that changes and persists, no growth pattern that locks in the information. One possibility is epigenetic memory. Chemical modifications to DNA, methylation patterns, histone modifications that don't change the genetic sequence but do change which genes are expressed. These modifications can persist through cell divisions. They can carry information about environmental history. Plants use epigenetic mechanisms to remember vernalization, the extended cold period that many plants require before they'll flower. A seed that experiences winter cold acquires methylation marks that persist through subsequent cell divisions, signaling that winter has passed and flowering can proceed. The plant remembers the season it lived through. But epigenetic memory has limits. It can store binary information, yes or no, cold or not cold, but it's not clear how it could encode more complex information like, this particular stimulus is harmless, or this neighbour is cooperative. Another possibility is that the memory is in the network, not in individual plants, but in the connections between them. In the fungal networks, the chemical gradients in soil, the pattern of root distributions that reflects past interactions. Research by forest ecologist Suzanne Simard in 2025 found evidence for this kind of network. Memory. Trees that had previously received carbon through mycorrhizal networks from neighbouring birch trees maintained stronger fungal connections to those birches years later, even when the direction of carbon flow had reversed. The network topology reflected the history of past exchanges. This is distributed memory. No single node stores the complete information, but the pattern of connections across the whole network encodes it. It's similar to how memories work in neural networks. No single neuron stores a complete memory. The memory is in the pattern of synaptic strengths across millions of connections. Damage any single neuron and the memory persists. But damage enough of the network and the memory degrades. Plant fungal networks might work the same way. The memory of past interactions is stored in the relative strength of thousands of hyphal connections. Individual hyphae die and regrow constantly, but the overall pattern persists because it's reinforced by ongoing exchanges that favour certain pathways over others. This would allow communities to remember, to retain information about which species cooperate, which locations are productive, which seasonal patterns are reliable, and to use that information to coordinate responses. Which brings us to something even stranger. There's evidence that plant communities can anticipate, can prepare for predictable environmental changes before they happen. In temperate deciduous forests, trees begin withdrawing nutrients from their leaves weeks before those leaves fall. Nitrogen and phosphorus are pulled back into the branches and trunk stored for the winter, ready to be redeployed when spring growth begins. The trees are preparing for autumn based on signals they receive in late summer, shortening day length, cooling temperatures. This is anticipation, using present conditions to predict future states and preparing accordingly. But it's more sophisticated than simple photoperiod tracking. The trees are integrating multiple cues: day length, temperature patterns, water availability, soil nutrient status, and they're adjusting the timing of senescence based on all of these, optimizing when to abandon their leaves to maximize nutrient recovery while minimizing the risk of early frost damage. According to research by phenology ecologist Andrew Richardson at Northern Arizona University in 2024, the timing of autumn senescence has been shifting in response to climate change. Trees are retaining their leaves longer in years with warmer autumns, extracting more carbon through extended photosynthesis. They're not just following a fixed genetic program, they're responding plastically to environmental variation. This plasticity allows adaptation to novel conditions, conditions the tree's ancestors never experienced, conditions that natural selection hasn't had time to optimize responses for. This is real-time learning. Not evolutionary adaptation over generations, but phenotypic plasticity within a single lifetime. The tree is experiencing new conditions, assessing whether those conditions are likely to persist, and adjusting its behavior accordingly. And in diverse communities, this learning is shared. Trees that respond early to a warm autumn signal that it's safe to retain leaves by continuing to photosynthesize. Their neighbours, connected through mycorrhizal networks and chemical signaling, receive that information. They update their own assessments. Collective decision-making emerges, not through communication in any linguistic sense, but through observing what others are doing and adjusting behaviour to match successful strategies. This is social learning, the same process that allows animal populations to develop local traditions, regional dialects, cultural transmission of knowledge, but implemented through chemistry and growth patterns instead of observation and imitation. And it creates something remarkable. Communities that respond to environmental change faster than any individual could evolve to adapt. When European forests were hit by repeated droughts in the 2010s and early 2020s, many tree species showed signs of increased water use efficiency. They were closing their stomata, the pores that allow gas exchange, earlier in the day, conserving water at the cost of reduced photosynthesis. This response appeared within a few years. Not enough time for genetic evolution, not even enough time for new seedlings adapted to drought to mature and replace older trees. The existing trees changed their behaviour, and research published in 2025 by drought ecologist Henrik Hartmann at the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry showed that this change was coordinated across mixed species forests. Beech and oak and pine, species with different evolutionary histories and different drought tolerances, all showed similar shifts in stomatal behaviour over the same time frame. They were learning from each other. Species that naturally closed stomata earlier under drought stress were signalling that strategy, through reduced water uptake from shared soil, through chemical signals, through observed success in maintaining health while neighbours declined. Other species adjusted to match. This is adaptive plasticity at the community level. Not individual trees optimizing in isolation, but networks of trees integrating information and coordinating responses. It's also a form of cooperation under stress, because coordinated water conservation benefits everyone. If all the trees in a forest reduce their water use simultaneously, soil moisture is preserved longer. The whole community benefits from the collective restraint. But if some trees defect, continuing to use water freely while others conserve, those defectors gain a short-term advantage. More photosynthesis, more growth, more reproduction, at the expense of the cooperators who are sacrificing to preserve the common resource. This should lead to the tragedy of the commons, the classic problem where individual incentives to exploit a shared resource lead to collective collapse. But it doesn't, or at least not always. Plant communities maintain cooperation through drought, through nutrient limitation, through herbivore outbreaks. They don't always collapse into competitive free-for-alls. How? Part of the answer is enforcement through the mycorrhizal network. As we discussed earlier, fungi can punish plants that take more than they give. During drought, fungi can preferentially supply water to plants that are contributing more carbon, creating an incentive structure that rewards conservation. But there's another mechanism, one that's less about punishment and more about aligned incentives. Plants in a long-term community have a stake in the community's survival. A tree that lives for 200 years will experience many droughts, many disturbances, many periods of stress. Its long-term reproductive success depends on the ecosystem remaining intact, remaining productive, remaining diverse enough to support the fungal networks and pollinator populations and seed dispersers. It depends on. Defecting during one drought might provide short-term gain. But if that defection contributes to community collapse, soil degradation, loss of mycorrhizal diversity, increased vulnerability to the next disturbance, the long-term costs exceed the short-term benefits. This is the logic of iterated games. When interactions are repeated many times, cooperation becomes stable because the future value of maintained relationships exceeds the immediate value of exploitation. And plant communities are nothing if not long-term repeated games. The same individuals interacting for decades or centuries, the same networks reinforcing the same relationships year after year. Under those conditions, cooperation is Nash equilibrium. Not because plants are altruistic, but because defection doesn't pay over relevant timescales. But this equilibrium is fragile. It depends on the future mattering. On plants having a reasonable expectation that the community will persist, that investments in cooperation will pay dividends over time. Break that expectation through clear-cut logging, through conversion to agriculture, through climate change so rapid that the community can't track it, and cooperation collapses. This is what we see at the edges of forests. Trees at the boundary between forest and clearing show reduced mycorrhizal colonization, increased investment in competition, reduced resource sharing. They're behaving as if the future is uncertain, as if cooperation might not pay off. And they're right. Forest edges are unstable. They're vulnerable to wind, to fire spreading from adjacent grasslands, to invasion by edge-adapted species. A tree at the forest edge has a much lower probability of being part of an intact forest in 50 years than a tree deep in the interior, so it invests differently, more in immediate reproduction, less in long-term relationships, less in the community, infrastructure that requires decades to pay returns. This is rational, but it's also tragic, because the shift from cooperation to competition makes the edge even more unstable, reduces resilience, increases vulnerability, creates a positive feedback where instability begets less cooperation begets more instability. And as climate change creates more disturbance, more rapid environmental shifts, more uncertainty about the future, we're seeing these edge dynamics penetrate deeper into formerly stable forests. Communities that cooperated for millennia are beginning to defect, not because they've forgotten how to share, but because the conditions that made sharing advantageous are disappearing. This is the fragility of cooperation. It's not an intrinsic property of plants, it's an emergent property of stable conditions and repeated interactions. Change the conditions, shorten the timescales, introduce too much uncertainty, and it dissolves. But it can also be restored, because the mechanisms are still there. The genetic capacity for cooperation, for network formation, for resource sharing, none of that has been lost. It's just not being expressed because the environment doesn't favour it. Change the environment back, reduce disturbance, restore stability, give communities time to rebuild relationships, and cooperation re-emerges. This is what we're learning from forest restoration, from rewilding projects, from experiments in assisted migration and diversity planting. The most successful restoration isn't about planting trees, it's about recreating the conditions that allow trees to cooperate, rebuilding fungal networks, re-establishing nurse plant effects, creating the temporal and spatial stability that makes long-term relationships worthwhile. And when those conditions return, the forests remember. Not through conscious recollection, but through the genetic programs that evolved over millions of years of coexistence, lying dormant, waiting for the right environment to trigger their expression. The capacity for sharing is ancient, older than any individual species, older than many entire ecosystems. It's written into the fundamental architecture of plant life, because plants have always faced the same problem. Too many individuals, too little space, resources that are locally abundant but globally finite, and they've solved it. Not perfectly, not permanently, but well enough that forests cover continents, meadows sustain hundreds of species, and life persists in every environment where it's physically possible. They solved it by learning to share, and in sharing, they built the living world we inhabit. Let's bring this home. Because the story of how plants learn to share isn't just botanical trivia, it's a lesson about survival in a crowded world, and it might be the most important lesson life has to teach. Chunk 7. The lesson. We started with a war ending, with competition becoming cooperation, with the most crowded places on Earth somehow, sustaining the greatest diversity. Now we can see how. It wasn't one solution, it was dozens, hundreds. Every ecosystem, every community, every relationship between neighbouring plants represents a different answer to the same fundamental question. How do you survive when there's nowhere else to go? The answers aren't gentle. They're not about kindness or moral virtue. They're about mathematics, about game theory, about what happens when individual optimization leads to collective failure, and how evolution finds its way out of that trap. Plants share because sharing works. Because the alternatives, total war, competitive exclusion, chemical scorched earth, destroy the very systems that make life possible. Soil that's poisoned to suppress competitors becomes soil that can't support the microbes you depend on. Canopies that monopolize every photon of light invest so much in height that they become vulnerable to wind and disease. Roots that extract every molecule of nutrients leave nothing for the decomposers that regenerate those nutrients. There's an edge to competition. Push past it and everyone loses. Plants found that edge through millions of years of trial and error. Through lineages that competed too hard and went extinct. Through communities that collapsed and were replaced. Through ecosystems that degraded until only the most desperate survivors remained. And gradually, incrementally, they evolved restraint. Not moral restraint, not conscious choice, but restraint encoded in genes, expressed through chemistry, enforced through networks that punish defection and reward cooperation. The mycorrhizal fungi that cut off plants taking more than they give. The nurse plants that shelter competitors because diverse communities are more stable. The trees that recognize kin and invest in their success. The chemical signals that warn neighbors of danger. The temporal partitioning that lets dozens of species use the same meadow in shifts. These are solutions, strategies that work, adaptations that have been tested across millions of generations and found stable. And they reveal something profound about living systems. Intelligence isn't required for cooperation. Consciousness isn't required for fairness. Intention isn't required for communities to self-organize into structures that maximize collective survival. All that's required is feedback. Mechanisms that connect individual success to community health. Rules that make cooperation profitable over relevant timescales. Plants have these mechanisms. They've had them for hundreds of millions of years. Long before humans invented ethics, before we developed language to argue about fairness, before we built institutions to enforce cooperation, plants were doing it. Silently, chemically, through networks that span forests and lifetimes that span centuries. And they're doing it right now, beneath your feet, in every forest, every garden, every patch of weeds growing through cracks in pavement. The conversation is ongoing. The negotiation over space and light and water and nutrients, the balancing act between taking enough to survive and leaving enough for others to persist. Because persistence is what matters, not dominance, not victory. persistence. A plant can't win. There is no winning when you're rooted in place, when you can't flee from competitors or predators or changing conditions. The best you can do is persist, survive long enough to reproduce, contribute your genes to the next round of negotiation. And the plants that persist longest are the ones embedded in stable communities, the ones connected to networks, the ones playing positive-sum games where cooperation creates benefits that defection would destroy. This is the geometry of coexistence, the architecture that emerges when organisms can't escape each other, can't relocate to empty space, can't solve resource limitation through expansion. They have to solve it through division, through specialization, through relationships that transform zero-sum competition into positive-sum exchange. And when they do, something remarkable happens. The whole becomes more than the sum of its parts. A forest becomes more productive than the same area of monoculture. A meadow supports more biomass, more nutrient cycling, more carbon storage when it's diverse than when it's dominated by a single species. Cooperation creates abundance, not immediately, not automatically. But over time, as relationships stabilize, as networks deepen, as communities converge on arrangements that work for everyone involved. This is the lesson. The thing plants have figured out that we're still learning. That in a finite world, with finite resources, long-term success requires sharing. Not because sharing is virtuous, but because taking everything leaves nothing. And nothing cannot sustain life. We see this playing out in real time as ecosystems respond to climate change. Communities that maintained cooperation are showing more resilience. Forests with intact mycorrhizal networks are surviving droughts better than degraded forests. Meadows with high diversity are recovering from disturbances faster than monocultures. The cooperation isn't incidental, it's functional. It's the infrastructure that allows rapid adaptation, collective learning, coordinated responses to novel stress. And where that infrastructure has been destroyed, through clear-cutting, through conversion to agriculture, through suppression of fire or flooding, or the disturbances that maintain diversity, ecosystems are struggling. They're less resilient, less adaptive, less capable of tracking environmental change, because they've lost the relationships, the networks, the mechanisms that allowed them to share information and resources across species boundaries. Restoration is possible. We're learning how to rebuild these systems, how to inoculate soils with fungi, how to plant diverse assemblages that recreate facilitation cascades, how to reintroduce disturbance regimes that maintain heterogeneity. But it takes time, decades, sometimes centuries, because you can't rush relationships, you can't force trust. You can only create the conditions that make cooperation advantageous and wait for it to emerge. The plants will remember. They carry the genetic memory of millions of years of coexistence. The capacity is there, dormant, waiting for the right environment to trigger its expression. We just have to give them space, time, stability, and maybe learn from them. Because we face the same problem they've been solving for 400 million years. Too many of us, too few resources, no empty continents left to colonize, no way to escape the consequences of our collective choices. We need to learn to share the same space, to find arrangements where everyone can persist, where cooperation creates abundance instead of scarcity. Plants show us it's possible. Not easy, not automatic, but possible. They show us that competition doesn't have to end in dominance, that diversity isn't weakness, that networks are stronger than individuals, that giving can be profitable when relationships are long-term and reciprocal. They show us that the most crowded places, the tropical forests, the species-rich meadows, the reefs and wetlands where life packs itself so densely that every square inch contains dozens of organisms, aren't war zones. They're communities, carefully negotiated, painstakingly constructed, maintained through constant communication and mutual adjustment. And they work, they persist, they adapt, they create the conditions for more life, not less. This is what we walk through when we enter a forest. Not just a collection of trees, but a negotiation in progress. A conversation 400 million years old. A solution to the hardest problem life has faced since it colonized land. How to share a finite world. The plants haven't solved it perfectly. There are failures, collapses, invasions that break cooperation, disturbances that reset relationships. but they keep trying, keep building, keep connecting, because they have no choice, because they're rooted, because they can't leave. And in that constraint, that inability to escape, they found something we're still searching for, a way to thrive together, not through dominance, not through isolation, but through relationships that transform competitors into partners, strangers into neighbours, individuals into communities, the mycorrhizal networks pulsing with transferred carbon, the nurse plants sheltering vulnerable seedlings, the chemical warnings spreading through the air, the temporal partitioning that lets a meadow support 200 species in the space where 20 should suffice. These aren't accidents, they're solutions, hard-won, tested across deep time, proven to work. And they're still here, still functioning, still building the green world we depend on. Maybe the question isn't how plants learn to share the same space. Maybe it's how we forgot. Because we evolved in these communities. We grew up in forest where cooperation was the foundation of stability. We developed agriculture from wild plants that had spent millions of years learning to coexist. We know this. Somewhere in our evolutionary history, in our genetic memory, in the relationships we still maintain with the crops and gardens and forests we depend on. We know how to share. We've just been ignoring it. Treating the world as infinite when it's finite. Treating resources as free when they're costly. Treating competition as inevitable when cooperation is possible. The plants are showing us otherwise. Every day, in every ecosystem that persists despite our disturbances, in every forest that recovers after we abandon it, in every garden where diversity outperforms monoculture, they're showing us that another way exists, that the math works out, that cooperation, under the right conditions, is not just viable, but optimal. The conditions are simple. Repeated interactions, reliable relationships, consequences for defection, rewards for contribution. Create those conditions and cooperation emerges, not from morality, not from consciousness, just from the basic logic of survival in a world where you can't run away. And if plants can do it, without brains, without language, without institutions or laws or any of the machinery we think is necessary for civilization, then maybe it's not as hard as we think. Maybe we just need to stop trying to escape, stop looking for empty space to expand into, stop treating every interaction as a competition with winners and losers, and start building relationships, networks, communities where long-term persistence matters more than short-term gain. The plants have been doing this for longer than animals have existed, longer than consciousness, longer than anything we'd recognize as intelligence, and they've built a world that works, that sustains complexity, that turns competition into creativity and scarcity into abundance. We inherited that world. We live in it. We depend on it. Maybe it's time we learned how it actually functions, how the foundations were built, how the systems that support us have persisted through mass extinctions and climate shifts, and every catastrophe the planet has experienced. They persisted through cooperation, through sharing, through relationships that turned individuals into networks and networks into resilient wholes. That's the story. That's what we've been following from root to canopy, from nitrogen-fixing bacteria to cathedral forests, from chemical signals to mycorrhizal highways. How competition became cooperation, how crowding became community, how the hardest problem in ecology found solutions that work. Not perfectly, not permanently, but well enough, long enough, well enough that forests still stand, that meadows still bloom, that life, in all its absurd diversity, still finds a way to pack itself into every available space and make it work, through sharing, through restraint, through the recognition that in a finite world your neighbour's survival is linked to your own. The plants figured this out. They're still teaching it. In every interaction, every transfer, every moment of restraint when competition could have been total. We started by asking how plants learn to share the same space. The answer is carefully, incrementally, through millions of years of trial and error, through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand, through relationships we've only recently learned to see. But they did learn, and they're still here, still sharing, still building communities from the raw material of competition, still showing us that another way is possible. We just have to be willing to look, to listen, to learn from organisms we've dismissed as passive, as simple, as incapable of the complexity we reserve for ourselves. Because they're not simple, they're ancient, tested, refined by selection pressures we can barely imagine, and they have something to teach us about survival, about community, about what it takes to persist in a crowded world. Maybe it's time we started paying attention